They found him alone, locked in a cold stone cell. No crown, no throne, no one left who dared call him majesty. He wasn't shouting. He was whispering, rocking gently in the dark, whispering one name over and over. Karin. Then he collapsed, face pale, blood rising in his throat, his hands clawing the floor. There was a bowl of peas beside him, half-eaten, still warm. A spoon lay on the stone, tipped over like a soldier who never made it home. That was how the world forgot Erik the 14th of Sweden, not with a war, not with a rebellion, but with a final breath and a mouthful of peas. They said it was poison. Others claimed it was suicide. But the truth is that his death was just the end of something that had died long before. His mind, because power, when it festers, does not explode, it rots. And this man, this king, had been rotting for years. He crowned a common girl as queen. He murdered noble blood with his own hands. He spent his final years speaking to shadows only he could see, not the first ruler to lose his grip, not the only one to confuse whispers for commands, but perhaps the one who fell the slowest and hit the hardest. So how does a royal mind come undone? How does the son of a national hero become a ghost in his own kingdom? To understand the madness, we have to go back to the boy who was raised to be king, but born into a legacy far too heavy to carry. He was born into greatness, but never born to be free. Erik, first son of Gustav I, was never truly a child. From the moment he could walk, he walked behind a man whose shadow didn't fall, it swallowed. Gustav Vasa, founder of Sweden's independence, breaker of Kalmar chains, and builder of a dynasty carved from rebellion, had created more than a kingdom. He created a mirror too heavy for any son to carry. And Erik. He was forced to see himself through it, daily, publicly, endlessly, not as a boy, but as a future crowned in his father's image. From the outside, Erik's childhood looked golden. Tutors praised his intellect. He spoke Latin, German, and French. He wrote poetry. He designed battle maps before his voice even cracked. A prince touched by vision, they said, but behind court doors, it was different. Gustav remarried. The palace filled with half-brothers Erik didn't trust, and stepmothers he wasn't allowed to question. The young heir became a symbol before he was a son. He wasn't allowed to play, only to pose. He wasn't allowed to doubt, only to obey. Every gift he received came with a price. Silence, isolation, the expectation to be more Vasa than human. And behind every lesson, every robe, every banquet was a voice whispering, "You will never be enough." It was there, in the courtly stillness, in the stiff glances of siblings already smelling future war, that Erik began to learn the weight of inheritance, not as gold, but as pressure. Sweden at the time was no quiet kingdom. Though freed from the Kalmar Union, it stood surrounded by wolves. Denmark to the south, Muscovy to the east, nobles within itching to rip back power from the throne Gustav had seized. Erik, even before his coronation, knew one truth too well. This was not a crown to wear, it was a crown to survive. And when Gustav finally died in 1560, the court didn't weep for the loss of a father, they held their breath for the rise of a son. A son they hoped would continue the Vasa line with strength, not knowing that behind the ceremonial armor was a boy already cracking beneath its weight. The day Erik ascended the throne, the sky didn't darken, the bells didn't toll wrong. But something had already begun to rot quietly, inwardly, and no one, not even Eric, noticed it yet, because sometimes the madness doesn't enter after the crown is worn. Sometimes it's already growing, waiting patiently beneath the silk, and once seated on the throne, it doesn't take long before pressure becomes paranoia. Power didn't corrupt him. It exposed the fractures already carved into his skull. When Eric XIV took the throne in 1560, Sweden expected strength. What they got was vision, sharp, unpredictable, and laced with something colder than ambition. He moved fast. He spoke in riddles. He wore black armor laced with gold, and his eyes, once praised as intelligent, now watched the court as if it were a game he couldn't quite stop playing. Some called it brilliance. Others held their breath. His early reign wasn't a collapse, it was a shimmer. Eric pursued greatness with the desperation of someone who knew it could slip away. He launched campaigns across the Baltic, fought Denmark in the 7 Years' War, flexed Swedish muscle against Eastern powers. On paper, it was progress, but behind every strategy was a twitch. Behind every meeting, a suspicion. He rewrote laws as if rewriting his own legacy. He changed court customs, questioned inherited titles, stripped noble families of lands, then gave them back just to see who would bend. He didn't rule with cruelty, he ruled with doubt, and doubt cuts deeper. Eric didn't trust his council, so he created secret channels. He didn't trust the nobility, so he leaned on commoners. And worst of all, he didn't trust his own blood. His half-brother John, charming, calculating, was watched with silent hatred. At state banquets, Eric would stare across the hall at him, unmoving, the air between them frozen. John knew better than to blink, but the real shift came not with war or law, but with maps. Eric began drawing things that didn't exist, borders that weren't real, threats no one else saw. He spoke of voices, of symbols, of celestial omens guiding his rule. He once ordered a nobleman's house searched because he'd dreamed the man was hiding knives in his floorboards. None were found, but the man was still arrested. The cracks weren't just in his counsel, they were in the mirror, and though no one dared say it out loud, whispers began to crawl across the palace walls, soft at first, then sharper. The king sees too much. The king sees things not there. But Eric didn't hear whispers, he heard prophecy. He believed he had been chosen to reshape Sweden, not just its land, but its blood. He spoke of purity, of enemies hiding behind noble names, of rot beneath marble. And when a man like that holds the scepter long enough, the difference between justice and vengeance starts to blur. The court smiled, the guards saluted, but in their eyes, fear had already taken root. And in the corridors of that golden palace, every step Eric took began to echo just a little too long. It didn't arrive like thunder. It came like fog, slow, silent, and already inside the palace before anyone noticed. Eric's mind didn't shatter in a single moment. It softened, it blurred. He still held court. He still commanded armies. But behind his eyes, something darker had begun to stir. He became obsessed with patterns, symbols in dreams, secret meanings in gestures, warnings whispered in candlelight. He claimed God spoke to him, not through scripture, but through shadows. And the nobles, they weren't just men in robes anymore. They were threats in disguise. He started locking doors behind him. Speaking in riddles, even his closest advisors couldn't follow. One morning, he accused a courtier of smiling with treason. Another night, he stayed awake, pacing the stone halls, mumbling names that hadn't been spoken in years. The guards began to rotate faster, the priests prayed harder, but no one could say what they all feared. The king wasn't just watching them, he was watching something else. The Stuart family, a powerful noble house with blood too proud and history too long, became his fixation. He saw betrayal in their silences, conspiracy in their absence. Nils Stuart, young and loyal, was summoned to court not with honor, but with suspicion. Eric welcomed him with a blade behind the throne. And yet, the strange thing. It wasn't rage that drove Eric. It was certainty. Cold, exacting, prophetic certainty. He wrote letters claiming he was the anointed scourge of corruption, destined to cleanse Sweden with fire and fear. He believed his bloodline was sacred, but polluted by traitors in disguise. The royal court, to him, wasn't a government. It was a stage of hidden enemies, and he was both king and executioner. One servant reported finding Eric in the royal library alone, tracing circles onto the floor with ash. When asked what he was doing, he said, "Preparing the room for truth," then laughed, quietly, for minutes. Still, none of this was enough to dethrone him, not yet, because fear, in a palace, works better than loyalty. And no one wanted to be the first to stand between a madman and his crown. But there was one thing Eric hadn't prepared for, one force more dangerous than rebellion, more destabilizing than war: love. He could silence nobles, he could exile brothers, he could kill with a whisper, but he couldn't control what her voice did to him. Karin Mansdotter wasn't born for the throne. She was a commoner, daughter of a prison guard, raised with no title, no lands, no shield of ancestry. She worked as a maid in the royal household, pouring wine and vanishing into silence like every other servant, until Eric saw her. And when he saw her, the voices stopped. At first, it was secret glances, then private visits, then weeks where Eric refused to meet his council, spending his nights speaking only to her, not about politics, not about war, but about dreams, fears, shapes in the dark he couldn't explain to anyone else. She listened, she didn't laugh, and to a king unraveling from within, that was enough to make her feel divine. The court was horrified. A queen must come from blood, from alliance, from calculation, not from the kitchens, but Eric didn't care. In 1568, he did what no Vasa king had ever done. He married her, officially, publicly, and crowned her Queen of Sweden. It was more than scandal, it was rupture. The nobles didn't see a love story, they saw proof that the king had lost all reason, that a man who spoke to ghosts now trusted only a servant, that the throne itself was no longer guarded by history, but by delusion wrapped in a velvet gown. But perhaps the real danger was Karin. It was what she represented. To Eric, she was peace in a world full of knives. To the realm, she was the final crack in a mask already breaking. His love made him vulnerable. And in court, vulnerability is blood in the water. Whispers turned to meetings. Letters passed between rival houses. His half-brother John, long waiting for the king to slip, now saw the opportunity sharpening. And Eric, he didn't see betrayal coming. He was too busy planning a wedding feast. Too busy tracing her name in ink beside his on royal proclamations. Too busy pretending, for just a moment, that the voices were gone forever, but they were waiting, watching, and soon they would speak again with blood. The wedding was still warm, the throne still smelled of roses, and then the knives came out. In the spring of 1567, Erik summoned Nils Sture to Uppsala, a nobleman, loyal, young, harmless, at least on paper. But in Erik's mind, he was poison, a traitor wrapped in silk, a shadow sent by ancient bloodlines to end the Vasa line. So Erik welcomed him with ceremony and a blade. At first, it was interrogation, then isolation, then silence. And one morning, in a locked chamber inside the royal palace, Erik, King of Sweden, ruler by God's grace, drew a dagger and stabbed Nils to death, not with fury, but with eerie calm, over and over. As if removing a tumor the court could not see, blood on the walls, blood on his hands, no orders given, no counsel summoned. The king had become the executioner, but it didn't stop there. Something in Erik snapped open after that kill. He ordered the arrest of multiple members of the Sture family, nobles, children, elders. Some were dragged from their homes, others from prayer. Within days, 5 were dead, strangled, stabbed, silenced. No trials, no warnings. Just the sound of a dynasty being erased. And when it was over, when the blood had dried and the courtiers had gone quiet, Erik sat alone. Some said he wept, others said he laughed. One servant claimed he walked barefoot through the corridor, whispering, "Now the sickness is gone." But the sickness hadn't left, it had fed. The nobility froze. No one dared speak his name aloud. Even his allies stepped back, quietly, cautiously, because now they understood something terrifying. Erik didn't just see traitors, he killed them himself, with his own hands. And when a king stops hiding behind swords, the court begins to tremble. Yet behind all this horror, behind the crimson floors and whispered panic, one figure remained untouched. Karin. He kept her close. He kissed her gently. He placed her in the center of the storm like a calm the wind could not move. To Erik, she was still light, but to everyone else, she was now the eye of a hurricane, and the storm had only just begun. The blood had dried, but Erik was still listening, for footsteps no one heard, for voices no one else believed were real. After the Sture murders, something inside him no longer tried to hide. He stopped pretending. The veil of ceremony slipped, and what stepped into the throne room wasn't a king, it was a mind without guardrails. He paced his palace halls like a prisoner who thought he was free. He stared at paintings for hours, speaking to them like old friends. He whispered orders to invisible men, then punished real ones for not following them. One night, he accused a court musician of treason for playing a note too sorrowful. Another evening, he demanded that all windows in the castle be covered, claiming the moon was spying on him. His letters became unreadable, lines of scripture tangled with symbols, names scratched out, replaced by celestial signs and strange geometries. Some pages were found stained in wine, others in blood. The royal court grew colder by the hour, not because winter was coming, but because no one knew what would trigger the next execution. A smile, a name spoken too casually, a silence that lasted too long. The king's rage no longer came with warning, it came with stillness, then burst. Erik began to surround himself not with nobles, but astrologers. He trusted omens over advisors. Maps were drawn based on stars. Political decisions were dictated by the alignment of planets. He believed he was chosen not just to rule, but to purge, to cleanse the kingdom of liars, deceivers, corrupted lineages passed down like a hidden disease. Some said he was possessed, others said he was cursed, but those who had known him as a boy, the scholars, the generals, the priests, they said something simpler and far more terrifying: he is no longer in there. Only Karen remained untouched. She read to him in the dark. She kissed his temple when the fever took over. She sat beside him when he forgot who he was. To some, she was a saint. To others, a symbol of how far the crown had fallen. And far it would fall, because while Eric screamed at shadows and planets, his brother John was gathering men with swords. The traitors he feared weren't hiding in shadows. One of them was smiling across the family table. John, Eric's half-brother, had waited patiently. He had bowed, nodded, obeyed. He had watched Eric lose himself to whispers, to blood, to stars. And while Eric was chasing omens in the dark, John was building alliances in the daylight. By the summer of 1568, it was no longer a question of if Eric would fall, but when. Nobles who once kept quiet out of fear now wrote letters sealed with urgency. Soldiers who once swore loyalty began slipping away under new banners. Even the clergy, silent for so long, began to speak in cautious tones. The realm must be protected from itself. And Karen, she knew. She felt it in the way the halls echoed differently, in the way guards bowed too quickly, too formally. She told Eric they needed to leave. He said the stars weren't finished speaking. Then it came. September, a swift, silent coup. John's forces entered the capital with barely a sword drawn. The gates didn't resist. The nobles didn't fight. Most didn't even flinch. Because to many, Eric had ceased to be king long before the crown was taken. He was arrested in his sleep. No trial, no speech, no crowd, just a quiet knock, an iron chain, and a room that no longer belonged to him. They didn't kill him. That would have been merciful. Instead, they locked him in castle after castle, Urbihis, Vesteras, Turku, like a secret no one wanted to admit had ever ruled. His name was erased from official prayer. His titles were stripped. And John, now crowned as John III of Sweden, made sure his brother's story would fade not with fury, but with silence. But kings don't vanish that easily. Not the ones who spill noble blood with their own hands. Not the ones who marry common girls and curse entire bloodlines from a stone altar. And inside those castle walls, Eric was still listening, still waiting, still whispering. He no longer ruled a kingdom, he ruled a silence. In the years after his fall, Eric XIV became less than a man and more than a memory. He was shifted from one stone fortress to another like a dangerous relic no one dared destroy. Urbihis, Vesteras, Turku, castles with cold walls, iron locks, and guards who had orders but no answers. No trials, no visitors, no titles, just a name that wasn't supposed to be spoken anymore. But Eric still spoke. To himself, to shadows, to ghosts. There were days he believed he was still king. He wrote decrees on scraps of cloth, signed them with trembling hands. He drew maps on the floor with chalk, redrawing Sweden as he saw it in his dreams, fractured, glowing, pure. He addressed the guards with royal commands, then flinched when they didn't kneel. Some days he refused to eat unless Karen served him, but Karen was gone, and then there were the other days. Days where he sat in silence for hours, staring at walls. Days where he whispered to people long dead, his father, Nils Sture, even John. Days where he screamed so loud they had to chain him down, then apologized for the noise to no one. His writings, what little remain, drift between lucidity and terror. Some passages read like statecraft. Others are madness soaked in metaphor. He spoke of a sickness crawling through bloodlines, of betrayal stitched into the skin, of a woman with fire in her mouth who stood between him and the light. No one knows who she was. Karin, his mother, death itself. By now the court pretended he didn't exist, but among soldiers, servants, and wandering clergy, his name lived on, not as a king, but as a curse. They whispered that if you walked past his cell at night, you could hear him humming lullabies, sometimes weeping, sometimes praying, and sometimes laughing, soft, high, unnatural, but he never begged, not once, not for mercy, not for freedom. Because in his mind, he was still the rightful king. The kingdom had gone mad, not him, until one night they brought him a bowl of peas. It wasn't a blade, it wasn't a noose. It was a spoon, a bowl, and a silence too perfect to be innocent. On February 26, 1577, Eric XIV was served a simple meal inside his prison at Urbihes Castle. A bowl of warm peas lightly salted, the kind any prisoner might expect, the kind no one should fear. But within minutes of eating, Eric collapsed, convulsing, choking, blood rising through his throat. He screamed once, then nothing. By the time the guards reached him, he was already dead. Officially, it was illness, unfortunate but unsurprising, unstable mind, failing body, a quiet end to a dangerous chapter, but those who saw the body knew better. His fingernails were dark, his lips blistered. His organs, when inspected later, showed signs no fever could cause. He had been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, almost elegantly. The most likely culprit. Arsenic administered through something as ordinary as a peasant's supper. The weapon wasn't steel, it was trust, routine, obedience. All the things Eric once demanded turned against him, and who gave the order, no signature survives, no confession. But suspicion circles only one name, John III, now fully king, fully secure, and fully aware that as long as Eric lived, the throne sat on uneasy legs. Eric didn't just carry madness, he carried lineage, he carried memory. And in monarchies, memory is a threat. Still, there's another theory, one darker, one lonelier, that Eric did it himself. That after years of isolation, delusion, and humiliation, he whispered to the walls one final prophecy and chose to fulfill it alone. That the man who once killed nobles with his own hands finally turned that hand inward. We will never know for sure, because no court ruled on it, no inquiry was made. His body was buried quietly, his grave unmarked for years. A king erased not by sword but by spoon, not with ceremony but with indifference. And yet, there is something haunting about how it ended, not with rage, not with fire, but with peas, soft, warm, and full of silence. No funeral, no anthem, no crown resting on velvet, just a dead king, a forgotten grave, and a country that refused to say his name. After his death, Eric XIV was buried without ceremony beneath the floor of Vestera's cathedral. No royal procession, no chiseled epitaph, not even a stone with his full title, just dirt and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't honor, it erases. For years, his memory was kept like a locked door in the royal archive. Mentioned only in whispers, referenced only as a caution. He had once ruled an empire stretching across Baltic ambitions. He had spoken 3 languages, written poetry, mapped out war plans before his 20th birthday. He had loved a woman the court despised and crowned her queen anyway. He had fought for vision, for control, for legacy. But in the end, he was remembered for something smaller than a war, smaller than a crown, something smaller than himself. A bowl of peas. And maybe that's the truest horror of his story, not the murders, not the madness, not even the betrayal, but the way history tried to unmake him, as if he had never truly sat the throne. As if the blood, the screams, the spiral, all of it, was just a dream the nation agreed to forget. But kings like Eric don't vanish. They return, in rumors, in folklore, in stone corridors that still carry his footsteps, in voices that echo down church walls when no one's speaking. He may have died raving, but he lived as a mirror, of power unchecked, of sanity shattered, of royalty that devoured its own. Some say he was mad, others cursed. A few still wonder if he was simply born wrong, placed in a world too sharp for his skin. But one truth remains unshaken. He was king, he ruled, and then he rotted. Eric the 14th didn't fall to an enemy's blade. He wasn't overthrown in glory or remembered in song. He dissolved slowly, silently, under the weight of his own crown. A king who loved too deeply, killed too directly, and listened too long to voices no one else could hear. But he wasn't the only one. There were others. Another ruler who believed himself made of glass, too fragile to be touched. And another noble who turned childhood into ritual slaughter, hiding death behind velvet curtains. Their stories still linger, waiting to be remembered, and this channel remembers them. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just history. It's wrought beneath gold, sanity bending beneath ceremony. It's the sound a crown makes when it finally breaks. So subscribe to Tortures of the Crown. There are more kings to fall, more blood to trace. And in the next chapter, we follow the trail of one who burned the holy and was cursed to die by fire himself.